Hey, good morning, guys. How's it going? Woo! Day 2 of CornCon. Thank you so much for showing up early. And we've got a really awesome talk here, Winn Schwartau. I've been telling the kids, we have a famous hacker talking about his career as a sound engineer for bands like Pink Floyd. And they look at me like, who is Pink Floyd? Who is Winn Schwartau? Well, I'll tell you who Winn Schwartau is. You're going to find out because he's got a presentation here talking about from his very young age taking stuff apart and putting it back together and learning how to break stuff. EFF, you're going to, Kurt, every time you swear.
Fight on.
All right, so I'll let you start, Winn, and I'll continue to let people know, come on in. And it's a great presentation. This is a presentation that he gave at DEF CON.
Morning. I got to figure out, this is a Windows machine. How do I advance the slide, by the way? Which arrow? That's it. All right. Yesterday was really cool. I got involved with the teenagers, and one of the questions that came up was, how'd you get into this thing? Because a lot of folks in cyber didn't come from cyber. I was talking earlier with a musician guy, then there's a lawyer, and a lawyer guy, and all these folks. And one of the things that came out of this talk with the kids yesterday and the teens was there's a whole mess of stuff that you can do in this world, in the world of cyber, and you don't have to be an uber geek. You have to have an appreciation for it. You need to have the creativity. You need to have the enthusiasm, and if you have that, that'll really help. And I was trying to tell the kids that. And my career took some really strange paths I'm going to show you, but in many ways, no matter what you've done in an earlier part of your life, there's a way to really adapt it for getting into cyber. So my career really began a long time ago because both of my parents were serious electrical engineers. My father worked on the development of radar systems in World War II, and I just found out this last summer that he got accepted to MIT when he was 15 years old. Which is, my mother never told me. I was just doing research with MIT and the Navy to figure out how did a 17-year-old guy end up in the South Pacific on radar development. And that's about all I got. But you'll see, I started getting an education very early. My mother was the first audio engineer at NBC during World War II. And she has a whole mess of patents on stuff that she was doing. And does anybody recognize what this is? Anybody? Shout it out if you do. Come on, gray hairs. This is a cutting lathe where you would take music in and it would cut it on a disc, and that would become the master in order to produce vinyl albums. Vinyl, anybody? All right, we're gonna be going to some old technology. All right, vinyl, let's hear it, that's it. And she developed a lot of technologies for this while at NBC. This was my first beer at DEF CON. And that's my father and me. And on weekends, Friday and Saturday night, there were non-optional electrical engineering lessons. And this went on for years and years, which was both a good thing and a bad thing because I learned electrical engineering very early, but it also turned me into a know-it-all at like 15. And then I got slapped down later. So early on, we've all wanted, as kids, we had the shoe shine business. We had a lemonade stand or some such equivalent. I was a TV repairman because in those days, from my view, it was exceedingly simple to fix a television. You go to the neighbor's house and it says, my TV doesn't work, can your 6-year-old come fix it? Take off the back of the TV, remove all of the tubes, go down to the drugstore, test all of the tubes, grab the one that's bad, go back, plug them back into the TV, and I made 50 cents. I was a rich 6-year-old in my neighborhood. So I had a lot of these things going on. I was fascinated by electronics, and that was our neighborhood electronics store. Doesn't look like Best Buy, does it? We had to build absolutely everything. Does anybody here know who Richard Stallman is? All right. Turns out I grew up with him, and I didn't even realize it till I was 50, that he was the next door Dickie Stallman, and we used to build little transistor circuits at 7 and 8 years old. And I'm not going to get into that, there's kids in the room. But it was a lot of fun growing up and having these things to do when growing up in New York. If anybody remembers, this is what computers used to look like. Now, my first hack, didn't use that word back in the day, but my first hack involved these. Now, these are old telephones. And for the kids here, do you know how to make a phone call on this? You do? How? Show me. Okay, yeah, that's exactly, you do that. Now, back in the 50s, phone calls were really, really expensive. It was 10 cents a minute, even to call your neighbor or just call across the street. So my mother was very unhappy that I was a chatterbox and apparently using the phone a great deal. So what did she do? She showed me the bills and said, look how much money this is. And this bill was $6.04. But keep in mind, in those days, you didn't own the telephone, you rented it from AT&T. The phone lines, you had to pay monthly in order to have that access, just to have the wire. Then on top of that was the usage. So $6 a month back in those days was a fair amount of money. But my mother was really mad at me and reading me the riot act, so she decided to enact a security protocol on our telephones. Does anybody ever remember this at all? Yeah, okay, there's a couple of the gray hairs. Kids, you know what that is? It's a lock. And it was a lock to keep you from being able to dial the phone. Well, the next month the bill came, and it was just as high, if not higher. And my mother said, all right, how'd you do it? How'd you do it? How did I do it? Old gray hairs, how did I do it? With nothing destructive, no tools whatsoever. Yes, sir, go, shout it out.
Pick up the phone during the dead space and start clicking the numbers.
You start clicking the hang-up receiver, because inside of here is what's called a stepper relay. And if you click it once, it'll give you a 1. You do bap, bap, it'll give you a 2. And if you time it right, all you have to do is do it 10 times. You get an operator, and you go, hi, can you please connect me to? And that was it, because you had a landline. They don't care if you're a kid or not. It's a legitimate landline. And so I was in a boatload of trouble and started learning about ethics and morals and what have you. So that was early on, and I stuck to repairing TVs because the trouble with my parents was just not worth it. So a little later on, we had a neighbor who was working at IBM, and they bought me my first analog computer. And the guts under it, it's not terribly complicated. It's, a couple amplifiers and what we would call today as a differentiator, an integrator, and some very, very simple circuits. Then Dickie Stallman and I would build these kind of things. And then we decided to get jobs because we were 10 years old. And back in those days, local stores, there were no Walmarts and any of this. It was all Mike and Mary Myers meat market kind of neighborhood in New York. So the drugstore, he'd hire several of us to do an hour and a half a day or a week. So we were in and out of this drugstore all of the time. Now, some of you may remember what a drugstore looked like back in those days. All right, kids, What's this? No cheating, Dad. It's a what? All right, it's a telephone booth. We used to have telephone booths that were made out of very expensive mahogany and oak. God knows why they did that. And the object was, how could we make free phone calls on these things? How could we do it? Again, no tools, nothing destructive, just how do you make free calls in it? So the way these phones worked, some of you remember, you stick money down the thing and it registers and you get so much credit, 10 cents a minute locally, $3 a minute calling California. I mean, it was truly insane. So, how do you do it? This was our entire toolkit for hacking. So we got the phone, get a laundry box from the, can I say Chinese laundry and not get in trouble these days? But it was Chinese laundry on the corner right across from the drugstore. We cut it into strips about this wide and a penny. Anybody know how we did it? Say what, sir? No? What we did, took these strips, slide them down the dime slot until it won't go any further. And that's a good 12, 14 inches. Then you take your penny, phone in hand, drop it down the nickel slot. It registers as a dime and gives you your penny back. So if you have a bucket of pennies, you can call anywhere in the world for free, because the operator, you get an operator, hey, I want to call California. All she sees is the ting, ching, ching of the dime. Really a penny we're getting back. And oddly enough, we never really got caught for that. There was some suspicions at the drugstore, but these are kids. They couldn't possibly do that. Off to high school for a couple years, computers. And high school and I did not really get along. Probably had something to do with the SWAT team after we locked the principal in the closet. And there were other incidents, but so I made it all the way through 10th grade, a little bit of 11th, and that's when high school and I got a divorce. So I said, I'm going to go into the family business. And this was the first recording studio I ever worked at 16 years old, and this was 1968. And as I was talking about with folks yesterday, it's not so much about, do you know your protocols, do you know TCP/IP, do you know, my skill set still is systems. I can see and understand systems. It's just a skill I have. So I can't code. I am a miserable coder, but I can understand how things go together. So this is obviously a fairly complex audio system. Anybody recognize who was my first recording session at 16? Anybody recognize him? The Nuge. Ted Nugent. Yeah, he would record naked in the studio for some unknown reason. And then this was the first lathe. The one that my mother worked on was an antique system. Now the cool thing about this from our perspective today is this is an ICS system. A lot of electronics, all going to a mechanical system with internal feedback and a lot of analog circuits going on in order to be able to optimize. This was the first computerized, as such as it was, and this is 1969 as I remember, first computerized cutting lathe in the world, and I got to participate. I was very, very fortunate to have some mentors that taught me an awful lot when I was very, very young. So then, get an apartment, leave home, and of course, everything is very, very expensive, and we still want to make free phone calls. And back in those days, some of you may remember, there was a thing called the telephone credit card. And such as it was, there was a distribution system for the credit card numbers. See, who's this one? This was Sammy Davis Jr.'s credit card. So we made a lot of free phone calls, but I was a total jerk that I realized when the FBI showed up at work. I was using the same phone booth every single time at work facilities. Really stupid. And in those days, the FBI'd slap you around, scare the living bejesus out of you, and move on. So was that a legitimate hack? No, that's pure theft. So I got involved with more and more systems, working with some incredible people. Anybody know what this is? It is Robert Moog's first synthesizer at Electric Lady Studios in New York. And it was a tremendous amount of experience learning from Robert Moog on how these things worked. And then I built one of these and discovered that I cannot program an assembly language. Not a clue. I got it to do the equivalent in those days of Hello World. That's about as far as I ever got programming on this. And then for TV, we used to use decks, doing TV work to do audio, video synchronization, editing, and all of that. But so we were purely layer 7 at physical control surfaces with all this technology in the background that did not understand. Now in the studio, we used to, you remember a song by Paul Simon and Art Garfunkel called My Little Town? That was recorded live between New York and California because Paul and Art were having a pissing match. They didn't get along, but they wanted to do the tracks. So what did we have to do? We had to synchronize the audio, all the audio from California into the studio in New York. Only way to do it legally was to go to AT&T and pay them, in those days, $1,500 an hour to get a high-quality line from New York to LA. Well, that was too damned expensive. So what did we do? Everybody back in those days had one of these in their offices. We had our mini switchboard. And if you have the whole switchboard and all the electronics, you own the world if you know how to get inside of it and bypass certain types of logging circuits that trigger billing. And we were able to do that for virtually free, talking from the New York facilities out to the LA facilities. So we're living in New York in an apartment we can't afford, of course. And what do we get every month? We get bills. They want us to pay for electricity. They want us to pay for gas and phones. That just seemed terribly unfair to us because we were broke. This is how bills came. All right, kids, what is that? What is it, kids? Shout it out. A punch card. And who invented the punch card? Why are you looking at him? If you're cheating, you're out of here. Dad, come here. It's called Hollerith cards. And we used to get our bills on these in the mail. So this is what we would get. Various types of these over the years. So we said there has to be a way, and we had access to the computer center down at NYU because we knew people that were going to school there and we could play around on weekends. So how did we hack them? Anybody? How did we hack Hollerith cards so that if we used $15 of electricity every month, when we sent in our bill, we would get a refund of $15 every month? Well, how'd we do it? Nope. Make one new hole that does what? Puts a minus sign in front of the number that you owe because they left all the null fields completely blank. So we made money every month from the utility companies using this technique. So in New York, we're building recording studios, and everybody wants to do it on the cheap, of course, especially some of the up-and-coming studios that can't afford $100,000 consoles. So we had to do stuff as much as we could for free. All right, it's not advancing. Wonder why that is. AV guy. I am using the same next button. They're John's computers. Yeah, I don't even see the, will that do it? There, okay, for some unknown reason. We found that we could use a lot of old technology from the 40s and 50s because AT&T ruled the world. It was them and IBM. And AT&T had buildings everywhere in New York. And they would take the old electronics and put them into what? A dumpster. A dumpster. And we didn't call it dumpster diving back in those days. We called it midnight hustle in order to get free stuff from AT&T. And it turned out you could build recording studios out of an awful lot of this equipment to save massive, massive amounts of money. And yeah, that's what we did in front of AT&T buildings to build studios for free, because the amount of repurposable electronics that they'd throw it out because it was easier, cheaper, and faster for them than to repair it. And from our standpoint, being broke, starving kids, it was, okay, we can rebuild it. We can repurpose this stuff and make it actually work. And one of the great things that's inside, I mentioned stepper relays. The old phone systems were all stepper relay based, and there were billions of these things around the country in the time. But they would wear out, they'd go bad, they'd get dirty, corroded. And so we said, bring them on, bring them on. We can fix that. Stepper relays are based upon 10, which allowed us then to build decade after decade after decade of switching networks for audio video studios back in the day. So we were able to replace all of this kind of nightmare with this automatically, and a dial that we could actually dial up. I want channel 113 going to 239 over in room 7. So it was a little convoluted, but it was free, and it worked. So was this hacking? Maybe. That was my actual first home computer, where I spent a lot of time realizing I really am a bad programmer. I got the database to work, sorta, but not a programmer at all. So as the career moved on, that's my wife back in 1980, and she worked for a recording console company called Harrison in Nashville, and they put out the first automation system for recording, so it would repeat everything. It was a technology called VCAs, voltage-controlled amplifiers, and it was absolutely brilliant. It was amazing for its day, with only one exception. It never frickin' worked. But it was amazing, it really was. And it was the first time somebody had really tried to create automation. This was one of my studios in New York. We had one in the basement of a club and did our contracts there to do we did 96 live albums in 18 months, and we had a lot of fun doing that. Now, part of my handicap also is, even to this day, I can still see music. I can see the colors, the shapes, the envelopes, and all of the waveforms, and differentiate them. When I used to mix albums, I was able to do it almost with doing it visually. because when things sounded good, the waveforms became one way. When they sounded bad, the waveforms went another way. And that was called synesthesia, where there's a mixture of the audio and visual cortex, and there's some miswiring going on that you can use, I guess, for good or evil, and I used it back then for music. But all of this was about, I loved doing live recording, live events, because that's where real music happened. It didn't happen in the studio so much, it was rare. But live is where the energy occurred and people got into it. And so I got involved with doing an awful lot of live events. And it taught me about incident response. Because keep in mind, when you're doing something live, whether it's in a concert venue or a TV show, you only have one edict. The show must go on. There is no alternative. There is no way. I'm going to disconnect part of the network, and then I'm going to spend 3 hours, and I'll figure it out, and then I'll put, no, we did not have that luxury. You had, in many cases, zero time to get things back and working. This was my first major disaster. It was with Stevie Wonder and Bob Marley down in Kingston, Jamaica. And it was a big event because of the politics between the Brits and the money with the Chinese and the Jamaicans wanting independence from the British Commonwealth at the time. So it's very unsettling, and part of this purpose of this concert was to bring peace and love to Jamaica, man. It was all be good, man. So the concert gets started. Now we're in a soccer stadium. So a soccer stadium holds 120,000 normally. Well, in this one, everybody was standing on the field too. So there were 180,000 people in one of the poorest cities in the world. And they were scaling the walls. Remember the ad for World War Z and the zombies? Imagine that really happening with Jamaicans standing on each other's shoulders, coming over these 30-foot high walls. And it was like very unnerving. And that's why the British Embassy told us, build riot cages into the stage. You're gonna need them. So that's really nice and warm to a bunch of audio geeks who just want to put on some music. So about an hour into the show, completely lost power. All power went. No audio, no lights, and 180,000 people that were getting really annoyed very quickly. What do? I was flummoxed, but we had roadies, and roadies were those guys that were magicians on when we were doing concerts. Whatever you need, they could deliver it. Somehow, it was the roadies were magic. And one of them says, I got this. Turned out that with the Jamaicans' help, we plugged all of the audio and all of the lighting circuits into one pole transformer. So the pole transformer, what happens? It gets hotter than hell. So the roadie got 2 cans of CO2 and started blowing it at the pole until he got arrested. And we're watching the Jamaican police trying to arrest this guy, and we're trying to explain he's saving the show. Oh, it doesn't matter, man. We have to take him down, man, because this is terrorism, man. And I was like, no, there will be terror if you don't allow him to keep the CO2 on this for the next 3 hours. It worked. We finally got everybody to understand that we were part of the good guys. So, takeaways from that, always remember it, power's God. And for those of you that are a little older, you cannot assume that power is always going to be there. Cannot assume that. So back up. There was an incident in a big financial company in New York, and I won't name them, and this was 2001, 2002, and New York gets its brownouts, and this facility was in Brooklyn, and there was a power outage. Should be no problem. They had backup generators. They had the batteries. So they had 30, 45 minutes on battery, switch over to generator. Nothing worked. Why did nothing work, Abby? Why? Come on. All right. Why did nothing work? You know why? They never tested it. Yeah, they never tested it. So the generator had no oil left in it. And that ended up being a regulator's nightmare. Anybody remember who Liza Minnelli was? I got to do a lot of work with her, and we were doing a show, it was on Broadway, called Liza with a Z, and it was supposed to become a TV show because she was all sorts of famous because of cabaret, and she was also an amazing singer in her day. So what we were doing was recording a live concert in a Broadway theater, synchronizing it, hopefully later, with the video and camera feeds. Now, back in those days, we used machines like this. And on here, you had one magnetic track that carried a thing called pilotone. Pilotone was roughly a 60 hertz signal, 60 cycles, that later on would allow you to resynchronize the audio to other magnetic machines, except when it doesn't work. So we've got a few hours before we're going live on NBC. We're back in the studio. We got the audio. Good. We got the video. Good. You put them together. Not so good. Completely out of sync. We see that today on Netflix, Prime, periodically. Things are completely out of sync. So what did we do? We had to build some equipment really quickly so that we could manually, using the Lissajous pattern of the hysteresis synchronous motors that are driving all this equipment, to put them in phase lock. Except phase lock in those days meant manually turning it because we didn't have phase lock loops. We didn't have a lot of that technology in the early 70s. So we had to manually ride it 10, 12 bars at a time just to be able to keep them in sync. We had a lot of drinks after that show that night, just saying. And sync failures, as more and more recording artists wanted more and more tracks and flexibility, I was the international or the American distributor for some British synchronization equipment. And this session here was from Double Fantasy with John Lennon, where absolutely nothing worked either because British design and electronics in the early days was somewhat questionable. They could design the hell out of it. Jaguars looked beautiful, but they were always in the shop. Same thing with their electronic synchronization equipment. Same thing happened with Rod Stewart. We were doing Do You Think I'm Sexy? Again, running drums from LA to the main tracks in New York and trying to synchronize it, but we had to do it all by hand. And again, the takeaways from this are very similar because we live in a world of synchronization that requires nanosecond synchronization in many cases. If not, in some maybe we can get millisecond, microsecond, fine. But the granularity that we were going for was 1/60th of a second. What was that? 60 milliseconds granularity. Pretty easy. But back then, we had to do it all by hand, live. There was no technology that we could go, all right, push those buttons, get one lock, and we're good for the rest of it. Didn't happen. I was out in LA and got called to New York to do a thing with Charlie Daniels at Madison Square Garden. It was supposed to be a live concert. No brainer. We'd done hundreds of these things over the years. So I fly in and expect everything to be in some sort of reasonable shape with my assistant engineers. So we had big console. We were running 40, 50 tracks in from the stage and recording it on a 16-track tape machine. That machine weighed 1,100 pounds, just for the record, and we had to schlep it around wherever we went recording. So that was supposed to be easy. Take 40 tracks in, mix them out, 16 channels, no sync needed at all. It was an audio project only, no brainer. However, has anybody in this room ever had any trouble with union workers? So I had flown in, I'm jet lagged from California, and instead of having this set up, I had this. They had induced so much crosstalk, one channel talking to another, through ground loops, and that's an engineering thing which you never want to experience if you can avoid it, so that every single mic channel coming into that big console had exactly the same signal. There was no way to differentiate it at all. What do you do? What do you do? You start tweaking the hell out of these knobs to try to make one channel as bass drummy as possible. Get rid of everything else. Not easy, not terribly efficient, but, all right, I need a channel with the lead vocal. How do I get, well, you can EQ it, you can compress this. There's some techniques to semi-sort of do it. And ultimately, this goes down probably as the worst recording I have ever done in my life. We did produce it, we did get it out, but I have zero pride in it other than we actually got it. Again, security takeaways. I'll make the slides available. All of these have a lot of security technologies, takeaways. And you got to remember that Westworld, 1974 was the original movie, and it's where nothing can go wrong. Something's always going to go wrong. And if anything we learned in the record business, doing live concerts and TV, if it can go wrong, it's gonna. Murphy, we didn't know who Murphy was in the 1970s. Didn't know that for a while. But Murphy struck every single time we were doing something remote. So, Rosanna Dana said, you know, it's always something. And that's absolutely true. Murphy had we call a tent city in the studio. It's always gonna be something. And then test it all and make sure you have backup staff that's trained. But it gets worse. Anybody remember Plop Plop Fizz Fizz commercials? Well, we did an awful lot to pay the bills in order to be able to do all that fun stuff. Where recording studios made their real money back in those days was what's called jingle houses, doing all the audio for advertising on TV and radio. And that's where they paid full boat so we could give discounts to the real musicians who needed stuff. So in the studio, we had a console. We had 40-some musicians out, the orchestra in the actual studio itself. We were going to record it to an 8-track machine. Now, typically, in those days, you had between 45 and 55 minutes to do the complete recording session. So the musicians then could leave and go to their next gig, and then we would do the post-production afterwards, when things work properly. So we're in the studio, and then I'm in the maintenance shop. Next door to the studio, and the engineer, Ed Rice, huge guy, good guy, he says, Winn, can you give us a hand? I said, what's wrong? The console's on fire. The There's only one place that you can catch a fire in a recording console, and that's in the power supply. So unplug, smoke, and all this, deader than a doorknob. And we're trying to keep the producer from knowing what's going on, which is kind of a joke. And Ed says, "What are you going to do about it?" All right, Ed, give me 15 minutes. And back in those days, we had a ton of these little tiny mixers, 4-input mixers, that we'd use for extras in little places here and there. It was a kind of a utility tool that we had. And it was, I need 8 of these now. So we started ripping them out of all the other rooms, brought them in, and tried to emulate what that was over here, and had to bypass the entire recording console. It worked. The producer, after everything was done, and we made our time limit, yeah, we got through the session, but we did it all by hand on here, taking the outputs of these, plugging it into these, and again, manually adjusting all the controls without being able to hear the mix. Good thing we knew how to read VU meters back in those days. And again, takeaways, DR, disaster recovery, testing things. We had no backup power supply. Now, whose fault was that? The cheap studio owner? Probably. How many of you have all of the backup gear that you really think you should have? Come on, Rich. I got one guy who has every piece of backup gear he's ever going to need. And the power supplies, and the generators, and all that. Where do you work, sir? What? All right, we're coming at you. We're coming for you. One of the things that I've been preaching for years is the concept of graceful degradation. That when the IT hits the fan, which it will, and it does, what do? And too many knee-jerk reactions are, turn it all off, shut it all down. Now have a graceful degradation plan where you're not turning everything off. You've got to turn off the broken circuits. You can turn off a lot of the other connected ones that are not tied to mission-critical systems, like in hospitals, exceedingly important. Have a graceful degradation as part of your plan for bringing things back. Systemic collapse. Anybody remember Hank Williams, Jr.? We had a studio down at the Lone Star Cafe in New York, and that was where we did all these live albums. We broadcast live to 600 radio stations twice a week. So there's a band on a miserable stage where the bar has mirrors on one side. Behind the stage is all mirrors, which means that you get echo and reverb and god-awful sound. So Hank Williams is up there in this country bar in New York where all the country guys come in from Jersey and Long Island. And they're all happy and they're rocking on. Well, Hank Williams is a homophobe. And we had a visual up onto the stage from the basement studio. And a couple of apparently gay guys were up front by the stage, kind of egging him on and trolling him. Couldn't hear it, but we saw it. And Hank Williams, halfway through a live broadcast to 600 radio stations and 30 million people, walks off the stage, leaves the Lone Star, never to be seen by us again. What do you do? What do you do? Well, the producer, Robert Ogden, said, Winn, what are you gonna do about it? Typical of the C-suite going down to IT. What are you gonna do about it? I didn't cause the trouble, but you're at the board, you're at the controls. And I said to him, give me 30 seconds. What did I do? Anybody? 30 seconds, it was fixed. What? Holy, this kid got it. Come on, let's hear it for her. I rewound the backup 2-track tape to the beginning, told the announcer, Mike Fitzgerald, I said, just shut up and go with it. And we replayed the first half of the show and never caught any crap for it. For some unknown reason, we never caught. Well thought out, Abby, well thought out. Similar thing with BT Express, if you remember the early funk group. 1977 blackout in New York. There's an interesting phenomena that Con Edison in New York and big power companies do. Between 11:50 p.m. and 12:10 a.m., they take the aggregated total of the frequency of the power lines, which is nominally supposed to be 60 hertz, and make up the difference in error that they've accumulated over the year and make their final adjustments in that 20-minute window. Now, when you're a recording studio using hysteresis synchronous motors based upon 60-cycle operation, that's not a good thing. So this began at BT Express. This was 9 o'clock at night, and we do a playback of a recording, and the speed is off a little, and they're going to me, what are you going to do about it? And I said, and they laughed at me, I said, there's a blackout coming. And they said, what? Yeah, the city's going to black out probably in the next 15, 20 minutes. And the only reason I came to that conclusion was we weren't in the variable time. So if we weren't in the variable time, we had to be in, oh my God time. Something is really going to go wrong. And I was making a pure wag on this, a wild ass guess. And 15 minutes later, there was a total blackout. So all of these things teach you, or taught me certainly, how many ways things can go wrong, and you have to, I hate the phrase, think out of the box, but you have to think novelly. You've got to plan for anything that you cannot think of. Make sure somebody else thinks of it, because you'll never cover every single contingency. And it's really about a way of thinking and preparation that should be part of our world, especially because complexity breeds failure. We know that. Oh, let's add more tech. That'll fix it. That'll fix it. I was one of my big clients a number of years ago, and now I'm over at TCP/IP, said, your video is being choppy on our network. You got to fix it. I said, it's your network. You've got some collision. You have something going on in your... No, I don't. It's your video. It was like one of these very contentious things. And it found out that as they added more and more security products, the communication of all these security products was totally clogging up their networks. And it was turn off 12 things and everything is going to be fine. And your design of adding more and more technology was just making your problem worse. So thankfully, I had been down so many disasters in my career. And one of the things that I like to advise, back in the day, we'd get a new piece of equipment in. And again, this is all hardware, analog equipment. And the way that we would stress test it when it came in from the factory was twist all the knobs, crank everything to the max, crank everything to the minimum, crank everything to unknown conditions, and let's see if we can break it. The entire object was, can we break the console? Can we break the piece of equipment because the designers didn't do something correct? And in some cases that's true, some cases not. But the same thing applies in our world. Stress testing should absolutely be including full minimum, full maximum configurations, especially those configurations where you say to yourself, nobody in their right mind would ever do that. Yeah, well, who said they're all in their right mind? And somebody is going to do it. We've all seen some insanity out there. Play with all the knobs. Final list of preparation, sort of what I've learned over that career. I did that career for 14 years, burned out completely. and took 6 months off and started teaching at an engineering school in California. One of the things I always recommend, interdisciplinary. It takes a lot of different knowledge bases. So if you know TCP/IP really, really, really well, that's great. But you got to know some other stuff too around it. And that's why I always look at the world as systems. These are all complex systems. Back in my day, in the analog world, there were simple systems. There were much more complex systems, the Robert Moog systems, and then all of those systems that die on you for some reason that is not always immediately obvious. The blackout to me was obvious. So the rules, the ideas, the way to think, very, very similar from that world to this world. It's just a different technology. But systems are inherently systems, and they're gonna snafu. It's gonna happen. Thank you very much, you guys. Abby, congratulations on 2 questions right. You guys have been great. If you have any questions at all about this, I'm happy to answer 1 or 2 now. Otherwise, I'll be around for the rest of the day. All right, I'm out of here.